Memory. In this nugget, we'll be addressing memory. And when we talk about memory, we're going to address the various types of memory and the form factors that are involved. There's a great variety of different kinds of memory out there, sometimes quite confusing with all of the different nomenclature and stuff like that. I say that as if I know what the word nomenclature means, or if I can even pronounce it. Anyway, we also have deciphering memory here, where you'll take a look at some of the markings on memory, understand what that means. You'll take a look at what PC, 3200 memory is, and what PC 8500 memory is, and all those kinds of things, understanding those sorts of things. And then we'll take a look at the actual upgrading and installing of memory as well. Alright, as we get started talking about memory here, I want to address a few things. First of all, we're going to be addressing the types of memory, and this relates to the memory characteristics, what it's capable of, what its kind of bandwidth is, and so forth. And then there's also form factors, which we'll look at a little bit later on. And then there's also some additional data at the bottom of this document, which is available for you up on nuggetlab.com in the zip file there. And this is going to relate to the physical dimensions of the memory. Okay, although some of it also relates a little bit to its technology as well. But here we're going to get started at least with types of memory. And before we do that, I'm going to identify something that's not even on this list. And that's something called SIM memory, or single inline memory modules. The reason why I don't include it on the list is because it is so old, it's defunct. It still appears in the exam objectives for A+, though, for who knows what reasons. Any computer that's using a SIM is too old and slow to install any current version of Windows, including those that are listed on the A+ exam objectives. So to list SIMs on the A+ exam objectives is really just a history lesson. I don't know why they still have it there. But let me explain a little bit about what it is. And this is not a SIM right here. I just want to use it as an example to illustrate something else. What a SIM means is that it's called a single inline memory module. These are going to be shorter. They're not quite as long from left to right here as a memory module like this. But a SIM will probably have contacts, gold or sometimes tin, electrical contacts on both sides of it. Okay, and so there'll be one on this side, and then there would be one on the other side. Now, in a SIM, it's actually electrically still the same contact. Okay, it's really the same contact on both sides. On a DIMM, which is a dual inline memory module, then the contacts on this side are different than, electrically different than the contacts on the other side, and they connect to different things on this module. Okay, so that's only the difference between a SIM and a DIMM. Again, a SIM, the contacts are actually the same on both sides. A DIMM, they're both different on both sides. Now then, let's go back to our table here. For the types of memory that you have, we have a few different types here. First of all, starting with DRAM, which is dynamic RAM. This is the kind of memory that we use across all of these different types of memory that we'll see down here. This is kind of an umbrella that covers all of these, and it's just memory that has to be refreshed, electrically refreshed, in order to retain its contents. There's also something else, though, called static RAM. This actually still has to have an electrical charge to it, but it doesn't have to have a refreshment the same way that dynamic RAM does. With static RAM, or SRAM, it's what we commonly use for cache memory, such as L1, L2, and L3 memory, as well as other caches that are now available these days. Although it does not require a refresh, it cannot be used for main memory for a number of engineering reasons, among which is the fact that SRAM costs about 30 times more to produce, so that's one limiting factor. And the other limiting factor is that it, coincidentally, is also about 30 times larger in its physical form factor, price per pound, so to speak. So it's just not practical to use that for main memory, but it's very good for things like our cache memory, because it's also very, very fast. Then we have SDRAM, and again, right now in current memory, all memory that you will use is going to be synchronous dynamic RAM. Okay, so that's just one kind of DRAM that we have up here. So synchronous dynamic RAM is going to be synchronized with the CPU clock, and it uses 168 pins. Okay, so that's just something to know about. Then there's also three types of DDR memory. Now, these are critical for your current computing needs, because any computer that you see is likely to have one flavor of DDR. DDR here stands for double data rate, and this was kind of the first generation of it, if you will. It's DDR SDRAM. Again, all of these are going to be SDRAM. I just notated it for the first generation of this. And what happens with this is that it's a little bit different than conventional memory in the past, such as SDRAM. Because with SDRAM, it would synchronize with one CPU clock cycle. Let me just illustrate that here. Okay, like this. So for example, if I have one clock cycle here, and remember, one clock cycle occurs within 1 second, and this bus here operates at 1600 megahertz. Well, if I use common SDRAM, then it's only able to perform its operation or its function on each clock cycle. So let's say that the top of this, the plateau, so to speak, is one clock cycle. And then here's another clock cycle. And then here's another clock cycle. Okay, so it's only able to do something on that clock cycle. Whereas with the DRAM that we have now, DDR RAM, what happens is it's able to perform two operations. Once at the beginning of the clock cycle and once at the end of the clock cycle. Okay, so effectively it doubles this capability, giving us what we call a data frequency, in this case, of not 1600 megahertz, which we had here with SDRAM, but 3200 megahertz, which you can now take advantage of with DDR memory. Now, as I go back to the table here, notice that this also will change from 168 pins for SDRAM to 184 pins. And these DIMMs, again, this is true of all three generations of these DIMMs, are 64-bit DIMMs. All right. Now, DDR2 is faster. Now, don't confuse DDR2 and DDR3 to think that. That means it's twice as fast, and that means that this one is 3 times as fast. It could be, but this is just the succeeding generations. That doesn't mean that it's literally 3 times or 2 times as fast. All right? Now, so it's similar to DDR, because again, it's going to be double data rate, but in this next generation, it uses 240 pins, and it's still, though, a 64-bit DIMM. It is faster than DDR, and instead of using 2.5 volts, which I don't have listed on here, but this is 2.5 volts for DDR, it uses 1.8 volts for DDR2. Now, why is that an advantage? Well, it's using less electricity, and that's always a good thing. But it's also good not because it's just greener, but also because it produces less heat. The less electrical power something requires, the less heat it generates. That's another advantage. Also with DDR2, it can use a bus speed here of up to 1066 megahertz, but it pretty well tops out at that. And if you have to go to anything faster than this, you're going to have to go to the more current DDR3, which is pretty common right now on most new computers. And with DDR3, again, it's similar to DDR, but it's even faster. And the reason why we get succeeding generations of speed here in performance is because of electrical changes and engineering changes to the modules. There's reduced noise in them, for example. There's less crosstalk as we go up through the generations, and other things that help them to give us a cleaner signal and perform better. But this will use less power than DDR2, so it's 1.5 volts, so less electricity and even cooler. And this is common for both the Intel i5 and i7. Now the i5, and we'll get to this a little bit later on as well, i5 is generally going to use dual channel capability. i7 is capable of tri-channel capability. Okay, so that's some significant advantages that we see with those as well. Also, if you use AMD, AMD socket AM3 versions of the Phenom 2 processor also support DDR3. DDR3 supports higher megahertz, so it can break that 1066 megahertz ceiling. And again, dual and tri-channel support are going to double or triple the throughput that you can get with these as well. So it's kind of exciting where we are with memory right now. And DDR3, it's pretty staggering with its total throughput, which we'll see shortly here. Now then, before we move on to single channel, dual channel, and tri-channel, I want to address another item known as single-sided or double-sided. And the reason why I'm doing that here is because it can be very confusing with single channel and dual channel. Some people feel like they're synonymous. Single banked or single-sided and dual channel or double-sided. They're not the same thing at all. Okay, so to avoid the confusion with that, I'm going to address right now the single-sided and double-sided issue. And for that, I'm going to this graphic, this photograph, where I've got a memory module, okay, and this is just flipped over, okay? This is one side of one of them, and this is the other side of the same kind of a module right here. So as you look at this, I would ask you, is this a single-sided module or a double-sided module? It's kind of a trick question. The fact of the matter is, folks, I have no idea. We might say, James, you're not very bright. I mean, look, it's got chips on one side, so obviously it's single-sided. Not necessarily. You see, single-sided and double-sided simply relates to the fact of whether or not they have one or two internal banks. And these are actually called ranks of memory chips. What happens here is a dual-ranked DIMM module is going to have two 64-bit wide banks of chips. So maybe these two banks here are going to be logically stacked together in the module, and that would make it a double-sided, a double-sided memory module. Now, these two could be electrically related in the way I've just described, and I would still have chips on only one side of the memory module. So this could be a double-sided memory module with chips on only one side. You see how nice and confusing that is? And again, that's because doesn't relate to the physical form factor and where the chips are. It really relates to whether or not the two internal banks are electrically related to one another or tied together. And then, all that having been said, you might wonder, well, all right, James, what is it then? Is this particular memory module single-ranked or double-ranked? Because I just kind of used a what-if example over here. Well, I really don't know. I would have to look up this part number and contact the manufacturer, look at their website to see if it's a single or a double. Now, I will also say, though, that most of the time, but not all of the time, most of the time, if the chips are on only one side, it probably is single-ranked. It's just not necessarily that it has to be that way. This could still be a double-ranked module with chips on only one side. So again, that was single-ranked or single-sided, or double-ranked or double-sided memory modules that I was just discussing, which is totally different than single-channel DDR and dual-channel DDR. Okay, this is a totally different subject now, okay, although they look similar. What happens with a single-ranked DDR is it's going to use one single DDR module, okay, just one, in a single slot, and it will use, 64 bits of the DIMM, okay? So it's 64 bits in use. Now, this doesn't mean that I can only have a motherboard with one memory slot on it. There's not really many of those around. It could have let's say four memory slots on it, and maybe I have two modules installed. Well, they're both still single-channel DDR if that's all that the motherboard supports. Okay. What this means is that each one of them will use 64 bits. Now, that'll come to light a little bit more clearly as I move on to dual-channel DDR. With this, it will use two DDR modules in two slots to double the bandwidth to the system bus. So instead of using 64 bits, it will now kind of aggregate together and have a total of 128 bits. Let's go ahead and take a look at that. So then, using this photograph as an example, let's just imagine that where you're working with a single-channel DDR motherboard, okay? Then I would have, let's say, maybe I installed 1 gigabyte of RAM here. It's going to use 64 bits, because DIMM uses 64 bits, right? Okay? So we're fine. But then let's realize, let's say I have a lot of applications running and I need to run more applications concurrently, and I realize I got a performance problem. So I need to install additional memory. And that's very commonly how we will improve the performance of a computer, is by adding memory. Okay, because if I don't have enough memory, then it's going to have to use something called the paging file or the swap file in order to kind of fake memory, and that's storage space on the hard drive, which is dramatically slower than the speed of memory. Okay, so now I've upgraded my performance. I have 2 gigabytes total. 1 gigabyte here, 1 gigabyte here, a total of 2 gigabytes in this single-channel DDR motherboard. Now, what happens here is that each one of these sticks will still only use 64 bits. However, if this motherboard were actually a dual-channel motherboard, and this one actually is, it's the one I'm recording on right now, it's actually a dual channel, so what happens with this kind of configuration is that it will aggregate both of these bit paths, so we'll now have 128 bits that are used for this memory channel throughput, and effectively it doubles it, so it's a dramatic increase in performance. This kind of a dual-channel support is very common with the Intel i5 processor. Now let's also take a look here at tri-channel support. And tri-channel support, by the way, will very often have 3 or 6 memory slots, whereas single and dual channel will usually have 2 or 4 memory slots in consumer-level PCs. Servers might have more. But let's just say that we've got 3 of these instead of the 4 that you see. If I added another gigabyte of memory here, and it was tri-channel support, again, I have another megabyte, 64 bits, But now it would take all three of these, so it would take 64 times 3, and it would give me what, I've got vapor lock here, 192, wouldn't it? Okay, 192 bits total. And that's, again, common with the i7 Intel type of processor. Now, let's switch back over here to our table for memory types. Again, this is available on nuggetlab.com. And look at our various form factors. First of all, we'll have a DIMM. Even though a SIM is listed on the exam objectives, no computers are actually using them now, as I said earlier. But with a DIMM, it's a dual inline memory module. The pins are going to be 168, 184, or 240. Remember that the pins on both sides are independent of one another. And these are 64 bits, whereas a SIM would have been 32 bits, by the way. Then we also have some other form factors here as well. A SO-DIMM, which is a small outline DIMM. This only means it's a small DIMM. That's all it is. That's the reason why they're smaller is because they're used in notebook computers. The 72-pin DIMM, even though there's 72 pins, it's actually only 32 bits wide. And a 144-pin SO-DIMM is going to be 64 bits wide. Again, by the way, a SO-DIMM that uses 72 pins is a little bit older. I'm not sure you're going to see too many of those. Just about anything you see right now is going to be the 144 pin with 64 bits. And then we also have micro DIMMs. Now, this is going to be smaller than a SO-DIMM, and this is going to be used in your sub-notebook computers or netbooks, sometimes as they're called as well right now. They're going to be 144-pin SDRAM, okay, or 172-pin DDR, okay. 214-pin DDR2. So let's just go ahead and take a look at some photographs of these different kinds of memory modules as well. And then we'll also look here at the RIM, which is Rambus Inline Memory Module. That's the company that trademarked this whole technology there. And it uses a variety of different pins and so forth, as you can see here as well. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, except to point out that, number one, it's also quite nearly defunct. It initially looked like it was going to be a shooting star of memory and like it was going to be the main performer, but because of expenses and other things that came up, it never really quite reached its pinnacle of potential, I don't think. The other thing to keep in mind with this is that each RIM slot on the motherboard has to be filled. So if I've got 4 slots and only one actual memory stick to install, then I have to fill the rest of them with something called a continuity RIM or a CRIM to fill those empty slots. It kind of is used to complete the circuit, so to speak. Also, not all memory now uses heat spreaders, although most of them probably do. But with RIMs, even when DIMMs were not using heat spreaders, RIMs always did, so that visually you can see that they're always going to use a heat spreader. However, current DDR, DDR2, and I should also put on there probably DDR3 as well, is faster and less expensive than the nearly defunct RIM modules. So then here we have a photograph of a SO-DIMM, and this is one I took out of one of my laptops a little while back. It's a little bit smaller, doesn't really have a whole lot of memory on it, but the form factor is pretty much going to be the same here. We would also have other kinds of memory modules. Let me grab another one here real quick. This would be an SDRAM micro DIMM. Okay, and this is just another form factor. Notice that the SO-DIMM had a notch in it. I don't know if you saw that down at the bottom. Maybe I should go back to it. Remember that here there's a notch down at the bottom. However, with a micro DIMM, notice that there's no notching down at the bottom. That's one of the first things you can tell about whether or not it's a SO-DIMM or a micro DIMM. A micro DIMM, even though the photograph here looks about the same size, they're actually smaller, again, because they're going to be used in those smaller types of laptops. And then here we just have a photograph of DDR memory. We looked at this photograph earlier for other reasons, but identify that, it's got, if you want to count them all up here, it's got all the pins down at the bottom, which, remember, for the first generation of DDR is 184 pins, if you want to take time to count them. Now you're welcome to it. And then also that it's got these notches on the side. There's actually some flip-up levers that go into the notches that I'll show you here a little bit later on when we talk about actually performing the installation of this memory. Also, this notch that we see down here at the bottom is designed so that, again, you cannot take DDR memory and install it on a motherboard that supports some other kind of memory, because the notching will be in different locations. Now with DDR, that's not too terribly hard because the pin count is different, 184 here, as opposed to 240 pins for DDR2 or 3 memory, so it wouldn't fit for that reason anyway. But again, the notching will help to resolve any problems that you might have in getting the wrong memory into the motherboard. And then for DDR2, let's go back to this photograph here. If we were able to compare these, we'd see that this notch slides over slightly. It's in a slightly different position. But otherwise, besides the fact that there's more contacts down here, again, it has the notches on the side like we saw earlier there as well. And then for DDR3 RAM, this is actually one of the memory modules in the computer that I'm recording on right now. We see, again, we have a lot of contacts at the bottom. There's the 240 pin contact. This also has the notch that's slightly further over, even further, to again prevent it from being installed in a motherboard that does not support this type of memory. And then here's wanted to show you a memory module with a heat spreader on it, also known as a heat shield. Not all of the modules will have these, although most of the current ones seem to. But one of the modules I showed you earlier of the DDR2 memory with that had memory chips on only one side, that did not have a heat shield on it like this one does. These are generally made of aluminum, and some manufacturers kind of brag also that they have different styles of aluminum that they put on there and stuff, and a lot of them will have, you know, little flames kind of shaped like in fins that come up off the top of these. They're supposed to dissipate heat even more, and they'll say that the kind of aluminum that's used is aircraft grade aluminum. I don't know, maybe it's used on the F-22 fighter or something like that. I kind of prefer the aluminum that's used from the mothership, but that's just me. Anyway, so there's this kind of heat spreader that's used on there, and then if you have a RAM bus inline memory module or a RIM, then in the characteristics of this, remember that they always have these heat spreaders on them. Notice that the RIM also will have a big gap, and this is one way that you can identify it visually, is this big gap that appears between the contacts right down here, and it has the two notches on the bottom as well. Now, we've talked a lot about memory, different acronyms, and all these different kinds of things, and the confusion between single-sided or single-ranked, and, you know, single-channel and dual-channel, you know, all of those sorts of things. So now, in order to further the confusion, we're going to talk some about deciphering some otherwise indecipherable things about memory. I think they make memory decidedly confusing just to keep us on our toes. One of the things that could be confusing is the density of memory. No, this does not mean whether or not you can hit it with a hammer or not. What this means is how much each memory chip holds, and when you add them all together, how much total memory you have on that memory stick. So let's go ahead and take a look at an example. I think I've got one here. Let's take a look at this one. Okay, here's just a photograph we looked at earlier, and I'm going to zoom in on this. And I think we got the bargain of the century, because look at this. Although it says that this has only 512 megabytes, I, in my crack mathematical skills, can kind of figure out that since this is 64 megabytes, it says times 64. Wait a minute. Something's not right there. That must mean that I've got a lot more memory than I thought. So if I take 64 megabytes times 64, that equals, wow, 4,000 megabytes. In other words, 4 gigs of RAM. So I might have paid for only 512 megabytes of RAM, but did I really wind up with 4 gigs? No. You didn't quite hit the jackpot there, folks. What really happens here is, since this is in megabytes, notice that it says right there, 512 megabytes, and we're working with megabytes here on the chips. Each one of the chips is 64 megabytes. But it says by 64. What's that 64 mean? That is the bits. That's the number of bit width that this has. But since we're working with bytes, we have to convert this by a factor of 8. So we have to divide this by a factor of 8, because we're working with megabytes and you know, bytes instead of bits. Well, great. That shrinks us back down to 512 megabytes. So anyway, to calculate the density, you can do the math right here. You'll see this very often on these memory modules. But then you'll have to divide by 8 to make sure that you get the actual density of the memory. Let's also talk about something called parity. Now, rarely, again, this is one of those things that's nearly an antique right now. I'm not sure why this is on the A+ exam, but they talk about parity and whether memory is parity or non-parity memory. Let's go ahead and address what parity is. The purpose of parity is to identify corruption in memory. So perhaps, for example, at the time something was in memory, a power sag occurred, and it caused corruption in that memory somewhere. Well, how would you know that that data got corrupt? Well, with parity, what happens is it performs a calculation on the memory to identify that for you. There's really two kinds of parity memory modules. One of those is called even parity. One of those is called odd parity. One's not better than the other. It's just two different methods. With even parity, what happens here is when it looks at a byte of memory, and here we have 8 bits to make a byte, and you know that computational messages, if you will, are relayed in terms of bytes and bits, okay? And they're all binary in this case, zeros and ones. So what an even parity memory wants to do is it wants to count the ones that it sees in this byte, and it wants them to be an even number. So in this case, we have 1, 2, 3, 4 ones. That's an even number. So there's a parity chip on the memory module, and if it's an even number already, then it will just register a 0 here. So it does not add to our 1 count. So then when it gets to the destination, so it's transmitting this to its destination, and then when it tries to write it to wherever it's supposed to go, if it still has an even number of bits right here, when we combine it with the parity bit, then we'll know that, more or less, the data probably has not been corrupted. And then moving on down to this example here, then we would look at this next bit of data. Let's say this has got 8 bytes, but it's got only 3 ones in it, so that's not an even number. Well, even parity memory is kind of OCD. You know, it's got obsessive compulsive disorder. It says, I like everything to be even. So it says, I must add a 1 to this in order to make everything even. And it's not satisfied until it does that. And then, when again the data is written to its destination, it also has to be an even number. Now, if the data were to get corrupted, like let's take this last set of bits. Let's say that something dropped, or got corrupted here. So we had 001, 001, 01. Okay, that's the same. But then in the last 3 bits, it's supposed to be 010, but here we have 000. Well, it recognizes that the original had a 1 there to make that even. But now, when it takes the parity bit and it adds the 1 there, it sees that that actually makes it odd. Well, that's not what we want. We want to have even. So now we'll know that there's actually corruption in the data. And by the way, what happens when the data gets corrupt? Most of the time with computers that use parity memory, the system shuts down. Yeah, no warning or anything, just poof, gone in an instant. And it prefers to do that and potentially corrupt Windows than to give you corrupted data. I would rather have something a little bit corrupt and to have my operating system running. But anyway, that's the way parity memory works. Maybe that's why it kind of fell out of favor, because people didn't like their machines spontaneously shutting down. Gee, I sure hope they don't use parity memory in the computers that run air traffic control or anything like that. Anyway, we also have the same idea with odd parity. It's the same principle. We have 4 bits here that are turned on, so we would have to add another bit here to make that an odd number, to make it happy. Here again, we have odd numbers here in this case, 3 of them. So here we don't have to add a parity bit, so that would be a 0. Okay, and then if corruption were to happen here, like if this is my original data and this is my new data, the difference would be right here. We have a 1 where we're not supposed to, and we had a 0 here, so we have 1, 2, 3, 4 bits. Again, it would know a problem occurred, and again, the system would just shut down. Now, as an alternative to that kind of memory, there's also something else called error-correcting code memory, or ECC memory. And since it's similar to parity, I'm going to kind of go out of order here and go ahead and address error-correcting code. It does a similar thing. It does some error checking with the data to make sure that nothing's been corrupted. However, if it does detect a problem with single-bit errors, it's actually able to correct those on the fly. Normally, though, once again, you're not going to see this in A+ level computers. This is mostly a server-level function that you're going to see using this error-correcting code memory. Also, with memory modules that use parity and/or error-correcting code, you're going to see some additional modules. Normally, you're going to see, like say, even numbers of memory chips. These chips that you see on here on the surface of a memory module. But if you see an odd number like we see on here, then that very often is an indication that it's parity or error-correcting code. And the reason why is one of the additional chips will be used to calculate or to add that parity bit or to check for errors using error-correcting code. Let's also address buffered memory, which is also known as registered memory. And this, again, is something that you don't normally see on A+ level computers. This is something you'll typically see on servers instead. Because what happens with buffered or registered memory as opposed to unbuffered, and I'll just put that, you'll also see that term, unbuffered or registered memory, is that they will have a kind of a holding area for memory where the signals for the memory are redriven. Now, the only real reason why that happens is not to give it like a booster shot, so much as it is that the engineering of that allows servers to have more total memory capacity. So that's why a lot of times servers will be buffered or registered. They'll use buffered or registered memory modules because the way the motherboards has been designed, it's able to take advantage of that, and you can cram more memory into those servers than you could on, for example, an unbuffered or an unregistered consumer level PC. Now, when it comes to installing the memory, you're going to install it into memory banks and memory slots. You might say to yourself, James, aren't those the same things? I mean, well, they're actually related to one another, but they're not the same thing. You see, what happens here is as you go to the motherboard, what we're going to see is that we will have memory slots. That's the physical things that you're looking at right there. You would actually, stick the memory in. And I might be tempted. Maybe I've got 2 gigabytes here, and I actually do have 2 gigabytes in that particular module. And then let's say it's not enough. I say, boy, I need 2 more gigabytes. It'd be tempting just to put it in the next one, right? Kind of make it more organized and stuff. You would not want to do that, however, because very likely either the 2 additional gigabytes would either not be recognized at all, or the computer might not even start, might not even get past post. Because according to the motherboard's documentation, these would have to be installed in a certain order. And if you look at the printed circuit board right here, notice that it has DIMM A2, A1. Here it says DIMM B2, DIMM B1. So what we'd normally do is you install an A1 first and B1 second. And normally, for motherboards like this, you want to install in pairs anyway. So you would want to occupy both of those. So what that means then is that in this case, I might not install 2 gigabytes there. Just get my little eraser out here. Okay, erase all this. Looks like lipstick on this, doesn't it? Anyway, what can I say? So I would have to install 2 gigabytes here and 2 gigabytes here, and I'd have a total of 4 gigabytes, but they would be in the proper slots. Fortunately, these are also color-coded. Now, these are the banks that I was talking about. A1 and B1 consist of one bank. Okay, that would tie together. Those equal one bank. And A2 and B2 consist of my second bank. So if I had an additional 2 gigabytes, I would put 2 gigabytes here and 2 gigabytes here, and then I would have my total of 8 gigabytes. But you do have to check with the little booklet or the manual that comes with your motherboard or your computer manufacturer. Check online with their requirements for this, because you can only put memory in certain locations and in a certain order. Otherwise, it might not be read properly. Then let's also take a look here at, as we go back to deciphering memory, at the speed of the memory as well. Okay, what in the world is all that about? Well, if we go back to our PDF document, which is the same document we were looking at earlier, I just scrolled down here so that we could see a little bit more, then we'll see that I've gotten a calculation on this for you so that you can figure out the memory bandwidth, or speed of it, if you will. I said speed on the whiteboard, but really it's a measure of the bandwidth that's capable there. And what we want to do with this is you have to know certain information. For example, I have to know how it's designated. So maybe I'm at the computer store and I see a box of DDR3-1600 memory. What in the world does that mean? Well, that's an expression of the performance of that memory. And the simplest way to calculate this is you take the mega transfers per second and you multiply that by the bus width in bytes. So since the bus width is 64 bits wide, to convert that to bytes, you divide by 8. That gives us 8, because 8 times 8 is 64, right? So you would take the mega transfers, per second times 8. Now in this case, when we look at this memory stick, it says DDR3 1600. The 1600 out here is the mega transfers per second. Now, this is actually correlated to the megahertz of the computer, but most most memory manufacturers will incorrectly designate that. They will say 1600 megahertz. That's not really quite accurate, because the I/O megahertz clock rate is going to be 800. But you double that since we're using DDR memory. So we would take 800 times 2 would give us 1600, not 1600 megahertz actually, but it would actually be mega transactions per second is how that should be expressed. All right. So we would take 1600 times 8, okay, that times our bus width in bytes, and that would give us our actual total throughput. Let's get our little calculator out here. So that would be, let's do that again, 1600 Did I do that right? Yeah. Times 8 equals 12.8 gigabytes, or 12,800 megabytes per second. So if you want to just kind of get to the chase of it here, I kind of put it in bold here. The simplest way to do this is just to multiply the 1600 that we see at the end of our DDR3 and then the number right there. Just take that 1600, which is our mega transactions per second, multiply that by 8, and then you have this math right here, and then you're done. Now the only other difference you would have there is if you're using a dual channel or a tri-channel configuration, let me scroll up here, then you would be able to double or triple that. So we'd be able to take, let me get back to my calculator here, I would be able to take this 12,800 times 2. So if I'm using dual channel configuration, I would have a total throughput of 25,600 megabytes per second. Or, let me clear all that out. If I were to take 12,800 times 3, wow, I could get a staggering 38,400 megabytes per second. Now that actually is a staggering amount of bandwidth for memory, dramatically higher than what we've had in the years past. So anyway, that's how you would configure or determine the speed of the memory. Now another way to look at that as well, by the way, let's go back to our base value of 12,800. That was our starting value. This would be referred to as well as PC3 12,800. So you'll sometimes see memory designated this way instead. You'll just have to understand that this is a statement of the total bandwidth of that memory in a single channel bandwidth. Now here we need to also address actually performing a memory upgrade. Now this could actually be installing new memory or upgrading existing memory, either one. But what we need to keep in mind here, especially when it comes to upgrading memory, because you probably already have memory modules installed in most computers, is that you need to check the documentations and the website for the manufacturer of that motherboard. If it's one of those systems that you've built yourself, where you put all the components in yourself, then certainly you need to check usually with the motherboard manufacturer to see what kind of memory support they offer. Many of them, especially now with the newer motherboards, will only actually support specific vendors that have been tested on their motherboards and specific memory modules from those vendors that they have tested. So sometimes the list of approved memory can be quite lengthy, and in my particular machines, it's all included in the documentation that comes with my motherboards. However, I usually will also check the web, because the web may have some updated manufacturers that were not included in the printed copy, and so usually I can get more current information off of this. So that's one of the things of first importance, is you really got to check the documentation and whatever web documents you can find from that manufacturer on what works. And also, if you want to take a little extra time with this, normally I don't do this for a generic, a customer's computer. For them, I'll just find whatever works, for whatever's compatible and whatever meets their needs. But if it's for one of my own systems, and if I'm trying to maximize performance, then I'll also go to forums, also do a search against my motherboard's specific model number, and against memory, and different kinds of, there are different websites out there for tweakers that are able to overclock memory and stuff like this, and I might see what's been working for other people as well. And then there's also bank population. Now we talked about that already a little bit, but just remember that when we take a look at our motherboard, the motherboard has to be filled in certain order, has to be filled in pairs or in triples, depending on if you're using i5 or i7 processors, and whether or not you're using dual or tri-ranked tri-channel memory. So again, just make sure that you're filling these up in the right order, especially if you have any that are left blank. Now, when you upgrade your memory, you do also have to be very careful to match certain qualities of your memory, such as the speed or the bandwidth of it. For example, if I've got an existing motherboard that came with 2 sticks of memory in it, maybe it was PC3 6400 memory, which would be DDR3 800. Okay, another way to express the same thing. Well, if I go to the computer store and I say, hey, there's this new PC3 12,800 memory that I want to buy, I could put that in, but when I compare that with my existing 6400 and I install some new sets of 12,800 memory, guess what's going to happen? The motherboard's going to default to the slower speed. So this is kind of a waste of additional potential performance that I'm not going to really be able to get out of that memory, because it has to match the speed of all the modules and the throughput of all the modules, so I'm going to kind of be wasting my money there. If that's the case, if I've got 4 slots and 2 of them are already being used by this memory, for me, a lot of times I'll just spend a few extra bucks and get all 4 of them at the upgraded price that I want to get the performance out of. Also, do make sure that you can match as much as possible any of the other characteristics of that memory. Now, the speed and the bandwidth here, the throughput is very important, but other characteristics might have to do with something called the CAS latency. CAS simply stands for Column Access Strobe. Oh, what in the world does that mean? Well, this relates to the amount of time that it takes for a request in memory to actually get to the pins of the memory. You see, different memory is timed so that it will operate in different ways there, and so some might have a slower or a faster CAS latency. So, for example, something that's rated as CAS 2 might have to wait 2 clock cycles for that memory to get to where it needs to go on the pins of the RAM, whereas CAS 3 might take 3 clock cycles. Now, not everything is equal in all respects. Something might look slower, that it takes, CAS 3, it takes 3 clock cycles, but it might operate at faster megahertz than the CAS 2. So you have to be a little bit careful to consider all aspects of this as well as you go through. And then what I prefer to do is to also match the brand. I mean, if I'm upgrading my existing memory, and I've got Corsair memory in there right now, I really prefer to get a couple more sticks of Corsair memory, preferably the exact same make and model of that same memory. Otherwise, I take a little bit of a risk of introducing a different vendor or even different models from the same vendor, and the timing might be slightly different, and it could cause some stability problems and so on. So, especially with today's timing being as tight as it is with RAM, you're usually better off to get the exact same make and model. If you can't, of course, you got to just do the best you can. So if the brand doesn't match, at least make sure that the speed and other characteristics are matched as much as you possibly could. And when you start up the computer after performing an upgrade, very often the system might recognize your existing memory, but not recognize the additional memory. And that would often be the case if the RAM is mismatched, so some of this stuff here doesn't match up properly. It might also be the case if the RAM is defective. That does sometimes happen, and I have run into that from time to time. Or if it's just incompatible, and it could be that you're installing, DDR3 1600 memory into the motherboard, and the manufacturer says that it does support that, but it could still be incompatible because it's not in the manufacturer's documentation. Perhaps they already tested that memory and found that it wasn't compatible, or it caused problems with their motherboard. So there still could be some issues with that. Of course, we also have to understand why your customers will want additional memory. Very often they'll come to you and they'll say, hey, my computer is just really slow. And after you clean off all of the viruses and spyware off of their computer, you find out that, hey, this thing's still really slow. So now what are you going to do? Very often, the chances are that they don't have enough memory. And I talked about this a little bit earlier when you were talking about paging file and swap file. But let's say that here I've got a 1 gigabyte of memory, and it might not be just one stick, but let's just say our total memory is 1 gigabyte of RAM, and this thing just represents my memory. Although it kind of looks like a little school bus here, doesn't it? Put a little cab on the front here, and a little driver up here. Okay, anyway, so we have some things going on there. And we don't really have enough memory because maybe the user is trying to run something more complicated like what I'm running here, which is Photoshop. And maybe it requires, I don't know, 3 gigabytes by the time you add up the application, the operating system, and all of the files that Photoshop wants to open, which can sometimes be quite huge. So this is just not enough memory. Well, what would happen here? Well, by itself, it would just not allow the application to open, or it would deny you from being able to open up any of these large files at all. And so you'd really be stymied in what you could do. However, Windows by default also includes something called a paging, let's write this in here, paging, or also known as a swap file. Okay, they're really the same thing for all practical purposes. They just have changed the terms over time. But this just carves out a portion of the hard drive space, and it doesn't actually look like a pie slice, although I'm strangely hungry for a slice of cherry pie right now. Peri chai. Anyway, so what we have here is a slice of the pie, so to speak, out of the hard drive that's used for something called paging and swap file. This is going to be fake memory, okay? Fake memory. Since we don't have enough random access memory, we'll trick the operating system and the application into thinking that this is RAM when it's really not. Now, that seems like a good idea because, hey, after all, now that means that I can open up my applications. And if the pie slice here isn't big enough, it'll actually even grow it by default to make it even bigger if I need to. Problem with that is this is agonizingly slow. it's going to cause the hard drive to really thrash, which means that that hard drive light is just on, and it's just very, very busy trying to access what's supposed to be fake memory down here and accessing all this data, because the hard drive is thousands of times slower than actual physical RAM, and so it's really going to be very painful. That's why you would probably need to upgrade to memory. And then what I might do is maybe I'll get big with this and upgrade to 8 gigabytes of RAM. And once I've done that, then it will take most of the paging off of here, although technically speaking, there's always going to be some paging going on. Just the operating system and applications do a little bit of paging for whatever reason regardless. But at least I've relieved most of the burden off the hard drive and put it up here into memory. So now when it comes to actually performing the installation of the memory, it's going to be mostly the same in terms of the physical action of installing the memory, regardless of whether you're installing DDR, DDR2, DDR3. The actual physical act of installing, it's all the same. It's just that this notch, again, remember, moves slightly over for different succeeding generations of DDR. So the way this might work then is I would take this memory stick and I would put it down into the motherboard like this, and you can see here that I've already got 2 modules installed. And one thing to keep in mind with this is notice that these little clips over on the side of these levers, when the memory is properly installed, what happens is there's something in the bottom of these levers where the corner edge of this module will push down on it and flip these up. You may also need to take your thumb and press them into place a little bit better too. Sometimes they don't quite go up all the way, but they should usually. If you push this all the way down into this slot, then it should flip these up pretty fine. But I always confirm this by pushing them in further. Also, something to keep in mind with this is that depending upon the motherboard manufacturer, when you push this in, it really is a little scary sometimes because you're pushing hard and it just does not seem to be budging, and you really got to put some weight behind it. Sometimes it'll actually even hurt your thumbs a little bit when you push down with the pressure on this. The thing to keep in mind is that as you look at this, you just must make sure that you've got the right memory in the right module and in the right slot, and that it's oriented properly, because if we go back to this memory right here, notice that these notches are also offset. This would prevent me from putting this in reverse, because since this is not exactly in the center, it would not allow me to install this backwards. So first of all, make sure that it's not installed backwards. Also make sure that you're installing the right memory in the right motherboard, and then you should see this happen. And then once it's installed properly, you can see here that the lever does flip up like we show you right there. Okay. Now another thing to see here is, and I'll just get a little bit closer, let's talk about that notch again. As it's partway through the installation and the lever is still not quite all the way up, if you look a little bit closer, again, just make sure that the notching that you see there does match where it's supposed to be. I can't seem to zoom in here. Let me try that again. There we go. Notice that this notch is right over that little hump that we see in the slot itself. And then provided everything's lined up properly, like I've mentioned here, then you should be able to just push down with, sometimes necessarily to use a good deal of force. Just don't use it like a hammer and a chisel or anything like that. And then you should be able to get that in. Now, if you are really pushing down hard and something's still not going right, just take it out, reorient it. You may also want to go back here. Let me go back to this and just look for any signs of damage. Hopefully you haven't done that. But look for any signs of damage, especially in the corners, to see whether or not it was not aligned properly in the slot. And if that's the case, it might have scraped up against something or might not be just lined up properly. Also be really careful, because if you do damage this, then of course a lot of computer stores will not take it back for obvious reasons. Another thing to keep in mind is as you install the memory, if it shows any damage on the contacts down here at the bottom, again, computer stores may not take this memory back either. Some computer stores are getting very particular about this, because there's a lot of people that are do-it-yourself upgraders and they mess things up all the time. And so a lot of the stores are having to take back damaged goods, and sometimes it's a little bit difficult to detect on these memory modules whether or not they're actually damaged, especially because you also have to be careful about electrostatic discharge. Now, with this one, with the heat spreader, that's going to help a little bit, because the heat spreader may not be in direct contact with the actual chip. However, a strong enough static charge could still potentially send electricity through the heat spreader and onto the actual chips that we see inside of the computer. So still use good ESD protection measures. And then I'm just going to go ahead and cover notebooks here as well. I've got a whole other section on notebooks, but for the memory installation, it's pretty simple, and so I'll just stay on that here. In this older laptop here, and again, this is going to be the same for almost any laptop and whichever version of DDR that you're using and so forth. But here you can see I've got a couple of modules installed, and I just took off the cover. There's a little screw hole here. You just unscrew it and you remove the cover. This is different for all different makes and manufacturers of computers, so you'll have to just check the documentation there. A lot of times on the actual door that covers this up, it'll actually have a picture of RAM, which looks like kind of, a little picture of memory or something. So that might help that out a little bit in terms of identifying where this goes. And then when you install the memory, this kind of memory you install differently. You don't install it from the top down. You slide it in from the side. And you can see here that it's kind of slightly raised up right here. So it's up at an angle, and you push it into the slot. And probably at like a 20 or 30 degree angle, so you push it forwards from where we are at this position. And then what you would do is you would actually push down on it, and you do have to still make sure that you're protected from ESD and that you've discharged yourself. Here I'm actually, you can't see it, but I'm holding onto the side of the chassis over on the other side of the laptop there. And then when I press it down, what happens here is, let me try to move in. Other than the fact that I need a manicure, apparently, I need a mani and a pedi. Okay, that's probably a little too much information, isn't it? Anyway, you see when I push this all the way down that there's this clip right here that's got tension on it, and it will then flip over here and cover up that memory module right in that position. That helps to keep it into place. So the installation for these things is actually very, very easy. And it doesn't require, by the way, nearly the force that sometimes those desktop computer DIMMs require. In this nugget, we talked about memory, and we talked about a number of different things, such as the various types of memory and the various form factors. Remember the types of things like whether it's synchronous DRAM. We also talked about the ancient SIMs, which I think are actually carved out of stone by cavemen. And then we also talked about the more current DDR, DDR2, and DDR3 types. Then we talked about the form factors like SIMs, SODIMMs, microDIMMs, all those different kinds of form factors. We looked at deciphering the memory and having to understand some things about the various characteristics that we see there, as well as how to upgrade and install your memory, as well as also why you would want to install additional memory, which again relates to things such as the paging or swap file. Well, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.